So this is part four in a series of videos where I talk about how I stopped being an alcoholic. If you haven't seen those previous videos, you might want to go back and look at them, and I'll leave a link in the description. In the first video, I described how alcohol provided me with certain things that I was looking for. It allowed me to be at ease with myself and other people. It allowed me to be free from worry, and it also gave life a magical quality. Now, these were things that I was desperately looking for, and until I found a better way than alcohol to achieve these things, I just kept on going back to alcohol. So I had to find a better way of getting these things. Now, I've already looked at the first two in the last videos. What I'm going to focus on today is this magical quality and how I was eventually able to get that. Now, before we move on, I suppose I better define what I mean by magical quality. Now, I'm not talking here about leprechauns, wizards, and fairies and that kind of stuff. What I'm really trying to get at is this kind of very different relationship with life. And it's a relationship with life that I say experienced in early childhood, where everything just seems so much more interesting. There's this real sense of curiosity and this sense of wonder. This that life seemed so much more enchanted in early childhood, and that was something that I lost. But when I came across alcohol, it was suddenly back again, and that really drew me in. Around this time, at age 14 or 15, life felt very far away from magical to me. Back then, I was I become very cynical. I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin, as I talked about in previous videos. So it was ripe for what alcohol had to offer. Now, it took me a while, it took me years later until I finally realized that the problem wasn't my life, the problem was my perception. And this idea that the problem is our perception is something that people who abuse alcohol and other drugs can kind of get quite easily, because, of course, all alcohol does is change our perception, temporarily change our perceptions. And by changing our perception, suddenly life can appear wonderful and attractive again. But of course, life hasn't changed. All that's changed is our perception. And this is where imaginal practices actually come in, because they can do the same thing, only more effectively and more sustainably. So the way I'm using the word imaginal here is to refer to these practices we can use using our imagination, which actually lead to real effects on our life. And it's like this midway point between what's real and what's not real. So an example that we've already looked at in the last video is stuff like the loving kindness practice, where even though we're kind of using our imagination to create things like a golden sun or this image of someone who we can see sending us that sense of friendliness, even though it's only, you could say it's only in our imagination, it actually is more than that, because you can use these images to create real effects in our life. An example I like to use to describe what I mean by imaginal is my experience of driving here in Thailand. So I learned to drive here in Thailand, so I'm quite used to the roads. But I remember when I first got out there, I would react to people, behaving in ways that seemed a bit odd to me on the roads. I never so much, I never got really into road rage, but I'd certainly get angry. And when that would happen, I'd kind of have this, say somebody cut me off or something. In my mind, I'll be seeing this really angry and aggressive person who's trying to deliberately ruin my day. So what I started to do was I started to imagine that behind every car was this sweet old nun that I know, that she was driving these cars. And this had this incredible effect on my driving and my relationship with other drivers. And suddenly I found myself becoming much more tolerant. And I'd have things happen like, buses driving, cutting me off, driving right in front of me or whatever. And instead of being angry, I'd find myself kind of giggling at this image of this nun, this old nun, old Buddhist nun trying to keep control of the bus. Now you could just say to me, well, that's just your imagination. But there's two things to say about that. What was happening before when I was had this image of somebody out to get me? That was just my imagination as well. But in that case, I wasn't acting as if it was just my imagination. My mind was treating that as if it was almost real. So in one way, what I'd say is what I was doing was more real because at least I knew it was my imagination. And also, more importantly, by doing that, it made me a much safer driver, a much better driver, and it made the whole driving experience much better for me. So it had a real impact on my life. So much of the imaginal practices that I've done have involved meditation. And this is something that's quite common within Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism. And so you have things like the deity practices where people will not only visualize the deity, but actually get that sense of physically being the deity. And what that does, it actually completely changes our way of perceiving. When I did this, I tended to mostly focus a lot on dream characters, things that seem to be significant in my dreams. So our characters that would come up in my dreams. And what this did was it allowed me to see things in ways that I honestly don't believe I would have perceived otherwise, like to see things in a way I could never have even imagined perceiving. And this had profound effects on my life. Another key thing with me with the imaginal practices was how it actually changed my relationship with the rest of my life. So that sense, so what would often happen, I'd be focusing on the body in meditation, and there'd be that sense of kind of focusing, and sometimes there's a sense of waiting while you look at the body. And what would happen, and then images would come. But what started to happen is outside of meditation, that same sense of waiting for something to speak to me started to just happen naturally and spontaneously. And so rather than kind of me, looking at life with stale eyes, with this sense of, not really looking, suddenly there was this interest and this kind of waiting for life to speak to me. And this absolutely changed the way I was perceiving things. And this is very, very much like how I perceived things as a young child. That sense of wonderment came back. That sense of enchantment around life came back. And this is what brought that magical quality back for me. So there are many examples of how these imaginal practices benefited my life, but there's one I want to focus on here. This happened 8 years ago, and at this stage in my life, I'd already been away from alcohol 5 years. But I hit this patch which was particularly difficult for me, and it all involved my work and financial uncertainty. I worked as a freelance writer, and I suddenly ran out of work, and I had this horrible situation where I felt like I could let my family down in a big way, that I would no longer be able to support them. And what happened is I reacted to that situation in a very familiar way, in a very old way, in that I got completely overwhelmed by the situation. And at a time when I really needed to be doing things, I kind of froze and I took to my bed and I couldn't function. Now, for some reason, the image of a warrior appeared in my mind. And this image helped me perceive things completely different. Suddenly, I could see that, this situation required a very, very different way of me reacting. And I could see that what I needed to be was more like a warrior. I needed to be someone who enjoyed the challenge, someone who enjoyed the uncertainty, who enjoyed going out there and basically hustling for work. And for some reason, this image allowed me to inhabit that perception. And suddenly that energy, that anxiety that had been crippling me, now it started to do the opposite. It started to be this driving force that allowed me to do all the things I needed to do to get back on my feet. And this experience was such a game changer for me. And I suddenly realized that basically when it comes to life, all we really have is our way of perceiving. And the trick is to come at life with the most skillful way of perceiving. And that is something we can absolutely do. I'd already seen through the insight practices that there was no right way of perceiving life, and I'd already seen that with the friendliness practices that it was possible to change my way of perceiving. Now, this example, finally drove that message home, and it was as I say, a complete game changer for me. There's so much more I could say about imaginal practices, but I can only go so far in a short video like this. If this something, if this is something that you're interested in, please check out a teacher called Rob Barbia, and you'll find a lot of his talks are free if you go to dharmacy.com. And he's a wonderful teacher. He goes into this in great depth. So that's all for now. I probably will do one more video in the series. And what I want to look at in the next video is beyond the practices. So what this did for me is it led to a kind of permanent shift in how I was perceiving reality that I describe as well-being. And I'm going to go into what that well-being actually involves in that video. So thanks very much for watching.